Now, if we remove the cerebrum and the cerebellum, we can see what's remaining here. The very bottom, we have the medulla oblongata. And so if we were to continue to go inferiorly, this would all just be spinal cord as they continue down the body. Just above the medulla, we have the pons right here. Above the pons in green, we have the mesencephalon, which is also called the midbrain. And then above that, we have the diencephalon. Starting on specific features of the cerebrum, there will be two hemispheres. So each half is called a hemisphere. We have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. The space that runs in between these two hemispheres is called the longitudinal fissure, and that's actually what will help separate these out. And if you'll recall, the extension of the dura mater, called the falx cerebri, is what's going to dive into this groove. The cerebral cortex is going to be the outermost layer of the brain, and this is actually where you find the gray matter. So those are actually the cell bodies of the brain. On the inner layer, the cerebral medulla is all going to be made up of white matter. You're also going to see lots of folds all throughout the cerebrum. The top of the fold is called a gyrus, whereas the bottom of it is called a sulcus. So as we look at this cerebrum here are the gyri, so the tops of the folds. And if we were to dive down in between folds, these are what are called the sulci, so the bottom or the valleys. Now, one thing I also want to point out from this view is our longitudinal fissure, which is just this space. So we're going to draw an arrow pointing at the space here. But if you notice, the longitudinal fissure is actually going to be space going in between the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Now, each hemisphere is going to have four major lobes. They're just named after the bones that are going to be surrounding them. So the frontal lobe is going to be everything in front of something called the central sulcus, which we'll get to here in a moment. Behind the central sulcus is something called the parietal lobe. Behind the parietal lobe, even more posterior, at the very back of the cerebrum is something called the occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe is on the lateral sides of the brain. Now, there's specific features and fissures we also need to figure out. And our first one's called the central sulcus. Now, when you're looking at the central sulcus, this is going to be the one that runs the most amount of distance without stopping. And we'll look at that here in a picture in a second. The lateral sulcus is going to be found on the lateral side, and it separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. So as we take a look here, these retractors are actually pulling back the lateral sulcus here. So if we were to highlight that, we acted like it wasn't pulled back. It would just be some space running just like that. That would be the lateral sulcus. Now we also have to talk about the central sulcus, and that's what this sulcus right here is. You see how far down it goes. It goes from just about the longitudinal fissure all the way down to almost the lateral sulcus down here. So you can see it's a very long sulcus. And if you trace the surrounding ones, you'll notice none of them go as far as this one does. They all stop before them. So this one right here, you notice very short. This one doesn't start in the longitudinal fissure, and it just goes down to about right there. This one right there. Over here, there's a short one. Now this one right here, that one's pretty long right there, but it doesn't go from this longitudinal fissure up here. So the central sulcus is going to be the longest one coming from that longitudinal fissure. Now the temporal lobe, again, is below that lateral sulcus. So the temporal lobe is right here. And what the temporal lobe is doing is it's interpreting sounds. And that makes sense as it's on the lateral sides closer to your ears. And so that's where interpretation of sounds happening. There's a primary that's actually going to be figuring out what the sound is. And then there's a secondary region that surrounds it that's going to use past sounds to try to help figure out what you're hearing. And so this brighter spot's the primary, and just surrounding it's the secondary.